We start this episode on the continent of Africa, off the coast of Ghana, at the place where many Africans last touched the sands of their homeland before they were sold into slavery. A place called Elmina Castle. The whitewashed fort was built in 1482. The Portuguese used it as a warehouse for traded goods from nearby African kingdoms, exchanging guns and horses for gold and ivory. But history shows that the Portuguese soon found more commercial value in the people they were trading with than the precious materials they obtained. Elmina Castle was transformed into an important outpost for the transatlantic slave trade. Ships came in carrying goods and left with their hulls stacked with bodies of captives. This continued for over 300 years. Much of Elmina Castle still stands today, though it's not a slave outpost anymore. It's a museum. It's even got a special designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Tens of thousands of people visit it every year to learn of the atrocities that took place within the castle's walls. But its current caretakers refer to Elmina by another name, though, a dungeon. And they say visiting this place has another purpose for those who seek to address the past.
Visiting the dungeons would not only serve as just visiting, it becomes a place where, as a people, we connect to correct, and by that securing the future for everybody.
That's Ato, a tour guide who takes visitors on the journey through the dungeons. The tour covers the accounts of captured Africans who were beaten and broken down in the presence of their captors, as well as the rape of women and girls. He says revisiting the story of the site's past is only meaningful if it informs the future.
So practically, they had everything on the floor and they were sleeping in it. Urine, vomit, menstrual blood, and you seriously cannot underestimate the heat and the stench. And these, among others, explains why they were dying. And those that died were thrown into the sea. We can never be in a position to truly comprehend what they suffered. You just can't imagine that.
The place where Ato says all of this culminated was the castle's sole exit for the enslaved. It was one of the only spots where they saw any light within the dungeon. It's called the Door of No Return. No more than a few feet tall and a few feet wide, you almost have to duck down or turn sideways to pass through it. It was through this door that countless captives were taken away from their families and communities and sold into slavery in foreign lands. It was here the enslaved were forced into the African diaspora. And it was this departure point, Ato says, where the fate of the enslaved and their descendants changed forever.
Nobody came in here and went back from here to the boat and that's it. And what I try to let people know is that in the life of a captive, life never got better, it only got worse.
Looking at the Door of No Return in this context has given Ghana and people who can make the trip one way to respond to the harm. In 2019, the country started a campaign inviting those in the diaspora to reconnect to the continent. But this ancestral reflection journey to an African nation acknowledging the damage done on its shores is just one example of repair. In the U.S., there's a different set of harms, different calls for repair, and different points in history that the harm is tied to. This conversation is becoming one of the most important parts of the resurging reparations movement. It's defining what the harms are, how to remedy them, and who should benefit. I'm Saraya Wintersmith. This is What Is Owed. For this episode, we're thinking through a controversial part of reparations. In some cases, it's also a question that derails conversations about potential programs. We're talking about the different ways folks are trying to address who should get reparations. And, surprise, it's pretty messy. The truth is, there are endless ways to think about who qualifies for reparations. It depends mostly on what harm you're trying to address and who you think suffers as a result of that harm. You might consider the harm endured by Black veterans, who were largely excluded from the social welfare benefits offered through the 1944 Servicemen's Readjustment Act, popularly known as the GI Bill. Or you might consider Black people living in low-income communities, who were some of the most over-policed and disproportionately incarcerated during the decades of the so-called War on Drugs. And then there are Black elders, who lived through the period known as Jim Crow, where racial segregation was widely practiced and in many places legally sanctioned. Still, for many people, the modern reparations movement returns to the roots of the original proposal, giving the formerly enslaved an on-ramp into economic self-sufficiency post-Civil War. In Boston, the city now has a reparations task force that likewise begins with a focus on slavery. The task force has been directed to address reparations for the descendants of formerly enslaved Black people. That language is critically important for Aziza Robinson Goodnight.
We did push the mayor and the city council to use that language.
Robinson Goodnight is an activist in Boston who helped draft the legislation that made the reparations task force. She says it's important to focus reparations on the descendants of freedmen because it was these families who were first cheated and then excluded from the nation's wealth for generations. But focusing only on this group could also mean a large number of Black people in Boston aren't considered. Nearly 40% of the Boston metro area's Black population is foreign-born, and they come from multiple countries: the Dominican Republic, Cape Verde, Haiti, Somalia, Jamaica, Nigeria. That makes the city of Boston and its surrounding suburbs home to one of the most diverse Black populations in the entire country. And they may not be eligible for reparations if the task force ultimately focuses only on the descendants of Black people formerly enslaved in the U.S. Robinson Goodnight says she had to push the city to understand why that language mattered.
It was hard. It was hard to work with city councilors. I don't feel like we were actually working together. I feel like it was a thing that people understood that needed to get passed. It was a thing that was popular after Evanston had passed and Amherst had passed. But to really get full understanding of why a certain group of individuals that are asking for a certain thing, I still don't think there's full understanding.
Robinson Goodnight is not alone. There's a growing movement of people who share her views. And if there's anyone you can call a champion for restricting reparations eligibility, Yvette Carnell is it.
Reparations is a sacred claim. It's not something that I'm willing to negotiate away, not 1%.
Carnell is the president of the ADOS Advocacy Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to pushing for a federal program to pay reparations to the American descendants of slaves. That's where the acronym ADOS comes from, and that's who Carnell says should be uniquely eligible for reparations from the U.S. government.
We're talking about people who can trace their lineage to slavery, the institution.
Carnell won't say precisely how many members her foundation has. She only shares that she has a goal to have 10 chapters in place by the end of 2024. Boston, by the way, is one of the first places to set up a local ADOS chapter. But before the ADOS Foundation, there was a digital ADOS movement. Carnell takes credit for popularizing the acronym through that effort. She says it started around 2016 when she and a friend, attorney and media personality Antonio Moore, were appearing together on split-screen YouTube discussions about wealth among Black Americans.
This is Antonio Moore coming to you from Tone Talks. I have Yvette Carnell from Breaking Brown. We're here to talk about Black Economics 101. You want to say anything to the audience, Yvette?
I just want to say, hey, I'm happy we're talking about this and solutions and everything that people have been asking for.
Yeah. And
They talk about things like the gaping wealth gap between Black Americans and white Americans. Today, data from the Federal Reserve's Survey on Consumer Finances show the median net worth of a Black household sits at about $45,000. For white households, it's $285,000. Carnell says one day, as she keeps engaging with this wealth discussion, she picks up this book. It's called Capital in the 21st Century. It's written by this French economist, Thomas Piketty, and it talks about wealth concentration. It basically says, short of any intervention, people should expect the inequality to grow between those who inherit wealth and those who work for a living hoping to someday achieve wealth.
And the one thing that he said that kind of stood out is that wealth is baked in now. Like either have it or you don't have it. And you're not making it from labor anymore.
This starts off a fascination for Carnell. She keeps reading more. Reports from regional think tanks and regional Federal Reserve banks. And she sees a pattern of different economic outcomes for some groups of Black immigrants when compared to Black Americans. A Pew Research Center snapshot at the time showed that 20%, or 1 in 5, Black immigrants live below the poverty line, slightly less than the 28% of Black people born in the U.S. The study also showed that Black immigrants had slightly higher median income than U.S.-born Blacks.
And so I'm doing a lot of research and I'm realizing, and I'm talking to Antonio and realizing that, oh no, something else has happened to us.
The stats she sees about Black immigrants, and the stats she sees about the wealth gap, and the stats she sees about inherited wealth becoming less and less attainable trigger a new question about wealth.
So the question becomes, if you don't have it, and if this country and its leaders and its policymakers and its citizens are responsible for you not having it, what do you do? What do you demand?
Carnell decides that broken promise of 40 acres for the then newly freed Black people in America in 1865 is the same necessary economic intervention that can now help Black people catch up in the game of American wealth building. That's the demand. And she wants to persuade others that the Black people descended from those enslaved folks face a particular accrued disadvantage, one that stems from having ancestors who were exploited to build wealth for other people, and who were then systematically limited from other major wealth-building opportunities for another several generations, not to mention the individual acts of racism, discrimination, and domestic terrorism those folks suffered over time as they lived on U.S. soil. If you were creating one of those visual word bubbles where there's a big idea and then a bunch of little words around it, ADOS is in the center of this word bubble. What are some of the smaller words that go hand in hand with this term?
Plunder, wealthlessness. I would even say shoes, because we were the shoes that white America used to run the race of capital. And so that's why we say, listen, this is not just about being Black. It is not about being brown in terms of melanin. It is about being able to trace your lineage to American chattel slavery.
Carnell's hard stance on this issue has made her a bit of a lightning rod. Critics say she's peddling a divisive brand of identity politics, one that runs counter to the idea of Black unity. But she says that's the thing people get wrong about ADOS.
Why don't you like other Black people? Why don't you like Black immigrants? And it's not about like. And I tell people all the time, listen, if France ever pays Haiti reparations, I will dance in the street, I will have a drink, I will do all of that. But I will understand that nobody owes me a check, right? Like I'm not deserving of that because that's not who I am. I'm not Haitian, that's not my lineage. So I think we have to get past this idea because we are trying to get something for a specific group of people in America, that means we are antagonistic towards Black immigrants or we don't have a heart for other people.
But Carnell and others using the ADOS hashtag on social media have sometimes made punchy comments that could be interpreted as anti-immigrant, with dismissive references to people of foreign heritage. Carnell maintains that anyone who looks at the ADOS Foundation's Black agenda would find other policy proposals that would benefit all Black people, just not reparations. To undergird her argument further, she points to legal scholar and dean of the UC Berkeley Law School, Erwin Chemerinsky, who testified on reparations before California's State Reparations Task Force.
In the United States, under current constitutional law, and in California under Proposition 209, laws that give a preference on the basis of race are either inherently suspect or perhaps per se illegal. My conclusion is that reparation is most likely to be upheld by the courts if it's structured in a race-neutral fashion. That is, it's most likely to be upheld by the courts if reparations are for those who were descendants of slaves rather than for all who are black.
So that's first and foremost. The second thing is, it doesn't make any sense. If you are, let's just use an example of a Nigerian who comes from an elite family.
Sure.
And you come to America, I can't make a case for why you're owed anything. America is never going to say that it owes you something because of that, because it doesn't.
But there are other, broader ways of approaching reparations. They begin with focusing on more wide-ranging harms. The more inclusive approach to who gets reparations is often referred to as Pan-African. It's related to this whole bigger ideology, one that suggests that all people across the African diaspora, regardless of their nationality or where they grew up or where they find themselves at any point in time, share common interests.
It's time for an uncomfortable conversation about what it means to deal with the legacy of the untreated trauma from colonialism, but also the narrative that the language of whiteness teaches African immigrants about their distinctness, their separateness from the blackness in America.
Why are we warring with the diaspora? Why are we doing this?
I shouldn't say when have we not, but you know, it's a thing.
Happy Black History Month from your friendly neighborhood Black American. And to kick things off this month, we are going to start with a little presentation I want to call Death to Diaspora Wars. All right, so here's a list of similarities that we all have that we can reflect on so we can start acting like we got some goddamn sense. Starting with Black. We are all Black.
I don't care if you Haitian, if you Trinidadian or African, it's like we Black people. And that's the way the world views us. And if we don't view ourselves like that, we're just divided for no reason.
That's a mashup of Black social media influencers. Their content shows how much the idea of a united Black diaspora is catching fire in pop culture. This Pan-African perspective is the beginning of a broader view of reparations than the more limited view ADOS advocates. It also opens the door to a conversation that's bigger than just seeking a check to address the economic harms for the descendants of folks formerly enslaved in the U.S.
Black people, from the moment they were put on slave ships, earlier than that, from the moment they were captured, kidnapped, they have been fighting back. Like, they have been resisting, they have been refusing, they have been doing everything in their power to assert their humanity, to assert their basic human rights. That has not stopped.
That's Kelly Carter Jackson, Africana Studies professor at Wellesley College and historian in residence for the Museum of African American History in Boston.
There's never been a period in American history where Black people have not been fighting for justice, where Black people have not been fighting for liberation and freedom and equality and equity.
Carter Jackson says Black people in the U.S. have engaged in a long fight against an embedded legacy of racist ideas and systems based on those racist ideas. One main one being white supremacist ideology, or a belief that people with less melanin are inherently superior to those with more of it. Money, Carter Jackson says, doesn't heal that part of society.
Because if you can cut a check and then go back to white supremacy as usual the next day, right? Like, then that's not the point. The point is not to get a check. The point is, like, reparations is one part of the solution. And I think that Black people have sort of always understood that, but reparations seems to always be like the entry point.
To get to the heart of what should come after that monetary entry point, we talked to someone who works with a national group pushing reparations with that broader Pan-African perspective.
My name is Willard Lett, and I am the male co-chair for the New England chapter of the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America.
Willard Lett has been working with the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, or NCOBRA, for about 20 years. The group was formed in the late 1980s. Lett says working within it has shaped his own views.
When I was introduced to reparations, the idea was introduced as an economic idea. It was only years later that I actually reached the conclusion or the epiphany and realization that, reparations means repair, and it had to be broader than economics.
Lett says most people come to the reparations conversation as he did, with a laser focus on the money-related harms that slavery and subsequent oppressive systems advanced. But like Kelly Carter Jackson, Lett says a lot is missed when we think about reparations with that narrow focus. In order to heal the true scope of problems, Lett says any reparations plan needs to address white supremacy and the harms that ideology enabled.
Rather than reparations being about a broken labor contract where, we did this work and you didn't pay me. It's about a broken human covenant.
That broken human covenant is the broader harm he thinks reparations should solve. It's this idea of the nation's collective responsibility for the dehumanizing of and the stereotyping of and the theft of opportunity from Black people. Lett says, when you think about reparations that way, as a remedy for major human rights violations from slavery onward, it's clear the benefits, or fixes, need to extend beyond just Black people descended from those enslaved in the U.S. In some ways, he says, the remedy needs to extend beyond Black people, period.
The rationalizations and justifications that serve to allow Europeans to suffer the moral injury of treating other human beings as property must be addressed.
To undergird this argument, Lett and other members of NCOBRA point to the United Nations Principles on Reparation, a 5-point outline of the necessary parts for a reparations program. According to its website, NCOBRA takes the position that all Black people of African descent in the United States should receive reparations in the form of changes in or elimination of laws and practices that allow them to be treated differently and less well than white people. To be clear, Lett says that if a national government does enact reparations in the form of compensation, the payments rightfully belong to folks injured by the paying government. So, in the hypothetical example Yvette Carnell throws out, where France suddenly decides to pay Haiti reparations, shout out to the first Black Republic, Lett says he agrees. He, as a descendant of folks enslaved in the U.S., wouldn't qualify for any of that money.
I didn't suffer an economic loss in Haiti. And if there was a Haitian here in the U.S. and the federal government provided compensation, I don't feel like they would be eligible because they didn't suffer an economic loss.
At the same time, many Black immigrants have undoubtedly been impacted by the legacies of systemic racism and oppression that come from living in a society with a long history of white supremacy as a prevailing belief. Lett says there are plenty of Black immigrants who have been denied jobs, stopped by police, or otherwise discriminated against here in the U.S. because of their Blackness.
And for those injuries, they are due remedy. So compensation is necessary, but it's insufficient to be considered reparations. It's an element of the repair, but it's not the whole thing.
Lett says aside from addressing wealth and poverty, NCOBRA has identified 4 other injury areas to shape broader reparations remedies. They are nationhood and peoplehood, two things that were denied Black people for generations: education, health, and criminal punishment. NCOBRA is guided by this idea that to equitably address the many forms of injury caused by chattel slavery and its ongoing vestiges, reparations can come in as many forms as necessary. Kind of like helping a society that ate from a poisoned tree for a long time get rid of all its poison. When asked about some of the ways to address those injury areas, Lett says reparations is relational rather than transactional. To him, that means people in communities where the conversation is happening need to be creative and vigilant.
That may not be satisfying because it's not a clear directive about what needs to happen. But the fact of the matter is we have to be able to accept the fact that any solution that they have is contingent, and they must be prepared to respond to those reactionary responses that we'll have.
Even though it might seem like Lett is dodging the question, advocates in the reparations space say over and over that reparations remedies have to be determined with the input of those in the community asking itself what is owed. So, leaving a reparations program design up to someone else closer to the work isn't quite the dodge we might think it is. And what's more, Black people across the world are making their own demands to address the legacies of slavery and colonization.
No amount of money can restore the damage caused by the transatlantic slave trade and its consequences, which have spanned many centuries. But surely, this is a matter that the world must confront and can no longer ignore.
At the 2023 Accra Reparations Conference, heads of state from nations across the Black diaspora gathered in Ghana as President Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo called for reparations.
My hope is that this conference will chart a roadmap which will define the nature and incidence of reparations that collectively we seek. May God bless Mother Africa, Black people everywhere, and us all. And thank you for your attention.
Delegates there agreed to set up a global reparations fund, but there's no money in it yet. It's an effort to begin compensation for the 12 million or so Africans sold into slavery worldwide between the 16th and 19th centuries. Back in Boston, Aziza Robinson Goodnight contemplates, what would it mean for the U.S. and the world's colonizing nations to pay reparations to each place where they subjugated and enslaved Black people?
I think that it would actually help to heal our divides. I think that our divides are strategic divides. I know that all of our divides are strategic divides because we're so powerful as a people. We, meaning the Black world.
The Black world on the African continent and throughout the diaspora. But the questions we're tracking are all about the steps in building one reparations program. So, what does it take to push a national government to address a moral and economic debt? And when a government does, how does it do the math? That's next time on What Is Owed. What Is Owed is a production of GBH News. This episode was produced and written by our senior producer, Jerome Campbell, along with me, Saraya Wintersmith. Our editorial assistant is Mara Mellitz. Editing by Paul Singer. Production oversight by Lee Hill. Mixing and sound design by David Goodman and Gary Mott. Theme song and original music by Malik Williams. And an extra special thanks again to Lee Hill, who traveled to Elmina Castle in Ghana for the reporting in this story. We love hearing from our listeners. Leave us a voicemail at 617-958-6061.
GBH.